Hi, and welcome to part 3 of distributive bargaining. And in this tutorial, we're going to look at the positions we take during a negotiation, of which there are about a half a dozen. We're going to look at what it takes to close a deal, and then we're going to narrow in on hardball tactics and how to deal with them. There's 6 essential positions that we need to be aware of that we use during a negotiation. So right off the top, the first one is our opening offer. So this is about where we're going to start. And this is something we have to think about in our planning very carefully. Our second position is our opening stance. And this is really about our attitude. So we have to think about this. Do we want to be a little bit quieter? Do we want to be more outspoken, a little more aggressive, a little more gentle? Are we coming at this from a competitive point of view, from a more moderate point of view? That's our opening stance. We need to think about initial concessions. These are the concessions we make early on in the negotiation. We don't want to give away everything, certainly. What concessions do we make early on if you find yourself in a position where you need to give a little bit to get things going? The next one is to be really aware of concessions throughout the whole negotiation. Remember that as you're going through all of this, you need to be really aware of how concessions can really help create agreement. We need to look at our patterns of concession making, because the patterns that we are showing will give information. The patterns that our opponent is showing will give us information. And then we have to think about a final offer or making a commitment. At what point do we say, this is all I can do? And so you can map this out in advance, and sort of like a chess game, imagine how your opponent might respond, and then you should be able to have something ready or something close that you've at least thought about a little bit so that you're not caught off guard. So with this in mind, let's look at what has to happen in order to close a deal. And there's 5 approaches that you can use individually. Sometimes they're combined. But this, again, you have to make sure that you close the deal in a way that the deal is solid when you're done. One way to close a deal is to provide 2 or 3 alternatives that are all good for your side of the deal, but give the opponent something to choose from. I think car dealerships are often famous for this, where they'll say, first of all, do you want to buy or lease? And as they're getting you closer to closing, let's say you decide you're going to lease the car. Well, is it going to be 4 years, 5 years, 6 years? How much mileage every year? Do you want 20,000 kilometers, 24,000 kilometers, more? And they create 2 or 3 scenarios in front of you that you can evaluate. And now it's a question of not whether you're going to do it, but which one you're going to pick. It moves things along towards closing the deal without a lot of heavy pressure. Another thing you can do is just assume the close. What that means is you don't necessarily double check, but you move toward finalizing any agreement, documentation, and so on. Assuming the close is not assuming you have a deal and just walking away. You need a concrete final act, whether it's a signature usually or an exchange of cash for the product or whatever it is you're doing. And you skip over any of those little doubts that might creep up near the end. One of the other things you can do is split the difference. Sometimes it gets down to a couple of small things. It's kind of like the example of the lemon that we used, where sometimes you just cut it down the middle and call it a day, where you just do a straight compromise. And again, if we use the car dealership example, maybe you get close enough where you say, okay, I want a roof rack on my car. It's normally $500. Let's say the car is $40,000. The dealer wants the roof rack sold to you because it's a high margin item. You don't want to pay $500. So at the end, you might propose to say, look, why don't we cut it off in the middle? I'll give you $250 and we'll sign this deal away. And they might go for it. That way you don't quibble over whether or not to include the roof rack for free or not. An exploding offer is essentially got some kind of a constraint to it or a time limit to it, that if certain things don't happen, the deal's just going to go away. And at the very end, we have possible deal sweeteners. And these are the kinds of things that near the end of a deal, maybe it's closed almost, but you just need a little something. And maybe you decide to throw in something to say, look, let's wrap this thing up. And if you do this, I'll throw in the roof rack on your car for free. And that might close the deal quickly. So those are the 5 things: providing alternatives at the end, or you can assume the close, split little differences, look at exploding offers, and sweetening the deal at the end. Keep in mind that exploding offers can come across as ultimatums that may or may not fit, so be very, very careful how you use an exploding offer approach. And our last section when discussing distributive bargaining is to look at hardball tactics and how to deal with them. There are 7 key hardball tactics that go along with the other tactical tasks we were discussing before. And so some of them you're maybe already more familiar with, others may be new. Some are more hardball than others. I mean, some of them are quite gentle, but we'll have a look at them, and very important to understand them because they can be really, really useful. First of all, the good cop, bad cop idea. We've heard this, I'm sure, before, especially if you're working with a partner on this negotiation. Maybe one of you is really tough and not giving into anything, and another person is really gentle and friendly and develops the warm, meaningful relationship. And the whole idea is that the tough cop is really tough on the opponent, and then they kind of step back, and the nice person says, forgive my partner, he's really tough and this and that. But the tough person has delivered the bad news. So the bad cop has been the one that's been not necessarily threatening, but is saying, we're never going to take this deal. We can't accept this. We're not going to do that. We're not giving you anything. We want this and this. And what it does is creates a little bit of an anchor in the opponent. And then the good cop comes along and says, don't worry about all this tough stuff the guy's been talking about. Let's try to work on a deal. But the anchor's already been set in the opponent. So it actually makes it very effective for the good cop, so to speak, to actually work out other issues in the deal and build the relationship. There's the low ball, high ball idea. So this is simply things we've talked about before where, for example, selling the computer, which I mentioned in another tutorial. Let's say you're selling a computer through Craigslist for $500 and somebody emails you and says, I'll give you $300 for it, which is essentially a low ball offer. I don't take those things too seriously. Sometimes people get very offended by them, but the low ball is designed to create an anchor that throws the other person off. So anchoring may not be that effective in this case, but if the person who's selling the computer is not thrown off too much by the low ball offer, it will create this anchor that says our range that we're working in is $300 to $500 versus between $400 and $500. And what happens when these bargaining ranges occur is we tend to err towards the middle. So we have to be careful when the low ball offer comes in. It's the same thing with a high ball offer. So let's say you're selling the house, the example we looked at before. You're offering the house for $450 on the market. Somebody comes in at $380 and you come back with $445. In other words, you're not giving very much. You're keeping a high ball offer up, and that will send a message to the other person. It might send the message you don't want to negotiate, or you're very attached to your price. So that's the low ball, high ball thing. The bogey. The bogey is simply this. This is where you play up the importance of an issue that doesn't really have a lot of meaning for you or importance to you, but you do it so that your opponent thinks it's important to you, so that if they win out on that issue, you can manipulate the situation by indicating that it's really hard for you to give something up, but really it isn't. But what it does is create this dynamic that says, well, I've just given up something important of mine to you. Now I need something from you. So what we're looking for is the person to be aware that you've given up something important and that they'll be more willing to give something up to you that has actually a lot of importance. The nibble. This is something where we ask for a number of smaller concessions along the way. And this actually can be effective as long as you're doing it a little bit at a time. You're not doing it constantly throughout the negotiation, because it'll just get the opponent tired probably by the time you're done. So this is when you're asking for little things. If we're buying a car, for example, maybe you're going to want a deal on winter rims or that roof rack we were talking about, or a cluster of other things. We want little discounts along the way, which can be effective. And again, you have to use your judgment, because if it goes on too long, the other person may just get frustrated with you. The next one is intimidation. Now we're getting into harder ball, hardball. Intimidation, we have to be very, very careful because it may backfire. First of all, if you try to intimidate somebody, it's going to come off as threatening. It might come off as bullying, and that is very short-sighted thinking. Maybe the other person is going to try this on you, in which case we're going to talk about how to deal with those hardball tactics in a moment. So that's what intimidation is. Aggressive behavior, which is similar to intimidation or can be utilized as a form of intimidation. Again, we have to be careful that it doesn't come across as bullying because that might backfire. And over time, you might develop a reputation as being aggressive or a bully. And then a snow job. And this is something that can occur but also can backfire. So this is where we bring a lot of information to the table and try to almost drown the person in information so that they get a little bit confused, and you help them kind of sort out the clarity of the situation and make it work to your favor. And so you throw out all kinds of info about a particular situation in your negotiation, and then you kind of lead them through the mire of all of that information to something you find advantageous. So those are the 7 what we call hardball tactics. So now the question is, how do we deal with hardball tactics? Well, we have 4 options, and they're pretty straightforward. The first 3 you can do during the negotiation. The 4th one does not work in the negotiation, and it has to be cultivated before you actually sit down. So let's go through them. The first 3 that can be done during the negotiation begin with simply ignoring the hardball tactics. You just name it to yourself silently. Just say, oh, they're trying the good cop, bad cop thing, or they're lowballing me, or they're trying to intimidate me. And you just ignore it and come back to what you're doing. And often when you ignore it, the other person realizes the tactic's not working, and they sometimes let it go. You can discuss them. And what this means is you can actually raise it with the opponent saying, I see your aggressive behavior, and it's bothering me a little, and I'd like to have a good, clean negotiation. Could we be more even-keeled about this and have a discussion that allows us to get to the best possible deal? So what you're doing is discussing it with them, and you're inviting them to have a conversation in a different way, move to more productive conversation. Or you can respond in kind. What this means is using essentially the same or a similar hardball tactic on them. I can think of a few times I've done this in my life, not very often, and it can work. It can also backfire. If you use a hardball tactic on a hardball tactic, sometimes it becomes even more confused or crazy. So if somebody is, for example, being a bit aggressive or intimidating, you can be aggressive back, and sometimes it'll settle the other person down. It's sort of like they realize they've met their match. With some of the other tactics like nibbling or bogey and that kind of thing, these are fairly soft hardball tactics, and doing the same thing may not have any significant consequence instead of getting them to stop it. So for the intimidation and the aggressive thing, it can be a good alternative, but we have to be careful about how we do that. Same thing goes with the good cop and bad cop approach. Because if you do the same thing that they're doing, then they'll see it immediately, and then they might think something's up. And the last way to deal with hardball tactics is something called co-opting the other party. It's essentially a form of befriending the other party, trying to get them to get to like you and get to know them a little bit, and maybe see each other as sitting really on both sides of the same table versus on opposite sides. This cannot really happen during the negotiation. So what it can be, though, is a proactive way of diffusing hardball tactics, because the person may have more of an interest in your well-being and will be less likely to be tough on you during the negotiation. But this is about the relationship between the two parties. If it's a very long negotiation, it's probably not a distributive bargaining situation anyway. But if it's a longer drawn-out thing, there may be opportunities to co-opt the other party, but it's very difficult to do without it sounding like you're trying to manipulate them to get what you want, which most people will pick up on. So co-opting is proactive. It's done before the negotiation takes place, and in that way can possibly diffuse hardball tactics they might use.